Mr. and Mrs. Alberto Golfo. Same content of certificate is awarded to Mrs. Janice A. Solivio. Another certificate of participation is given to Mrs. Diana R. Onyo. Same content of certificate is awarded to Mrs. Dayal Rose S. Macarilay. May we request Mr. Macarilay? Certificate of participation is given to Mrs. Jetman P. Murata. Mrs. Murata, please receive your certificate. Same content of certificate is awarded to Mr. and Mrs. Rumineto P. Golfo. Same content of certificate is given to Mr. and Mrs. Nicolas Jr. Ayolohio. Same content of certificate is awarded to Mr. and Mrs. Dindo G. Yolohio. Certificate of participation is given to Mr. and Mrs. Cerny Senior Shera. Certificate of participation is given to Mrs. Jeanette M. Barbante. Same content of certificate is given to Mr. and Mrs. Graciano Jr. Sarabusi. Same content of certificate is awarded to Mr. and Mrs. Christopher S. Talangit. Certificate of participation is given to Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Lara. Certificate of participation is given to Mr. and Mrs. Eric S. Talangit. Same content of certificate is awarded to Mr. and Mrs. Jemre Gayon. Same content of certificate is awarded to Mr. and Mrs. Rocky C. Sanchez. Eva Gilo Chavez. Certificate of participation is given to Mrs. Ginalyn L. Rojas. Same content of certificate is given to Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Gomez. Certificate of participation is given to Mr. and Mrs. Ryan Senior Casitas. Certificate of participation is given to Mrs. Madeline Lara. Same content of certificate is given to Mr. and Mrs. Manolito Lara. Same content of certificate of participation is given to Mrs. Lina Engal. Same content of certificate is given to Mr. and Mrs. Rafi Senior Kalawigan. Same content of certificate is given to Mr. and Mrs. James L. De La Cruz. Certificate of participation is given to Mr. and Mrs. Christian C. Comedia. Same content of certificate is given to Mr. and Mrs. Joey P. Shera. Same content of certificate is given to Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Senior D. Luisan. Certificate of participation is given to Mr. and Mrs. Mark Joseph M. Paghubasan. Next, certificate of participation is given to for his active participation in the Prince and Princess Matatag 2023 of Valeria B. Lopez Integrated School for school year 2023 to 2024. Signed by our school head, Pedrito M. Piquero P1. Certificate of participation is given to Ala Jen L. Abdul Satar.